I think we can ask questions of our current systems. I think we can ask questions of the economic status quo. And I think we can ask questions about our individual businesses that doesn't have to be a full takedown of the capitalist system, but actually just interrogates the values that are undergirding it.
Welcome to the 1110 Leadership Podcast, where we tackle issues at the intersection of leadership, faith, and culture. I'm your host, Rob Shields, Vice President of Strategy at 1110 Leadership, and I'm joined by my co-host, founder and CEO of 1110 Leadership, David Spickard. Proverbs 1110 lays out a bold and countercultural vision. When the righteous prosper, the city rejoices. We're here to ask, what does it look like practically to be this type of leader? Leaders willing to invest everything they have so that everyone around them can thrive. Join us on the journey as we lean in, listen, and learn how to become Proverbs 1110 kind of leaders. The kind of leaders that make our cities rejoice. David.
Hey, Rob.
How are we doing, my friend?
Doing well. Thank you.
Yeah.
How are you?
I'm doing great. I see you have a new haircut. Looks great.
Yes. I just
For
got
our audio listeners, they won't be able to capture the full effect, but take my word for
it. Fresh cut. Yeah.
Fresh
feels
cut.
Good. Feels good.
That's great. That's great. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today, man. These interviews are out of this world.
Yeah, it's fun to have experts be a part of our podcast, and we're excited to share them all the time. And this is the same, just a really unique, in-depth topic for us to engage with that's certainly relevant for the leaders that we work with.
Yeah, absolutely. This is going to be a layered conversation, as many of the ones we have are. But I think this intersection of justice and the church, around leadership in the church, how that affects our experience with church, but then also how does that overlap into the world of business as we think about really being intentional in our own leadership? What lessons can we glean? So today's interview is going to be really rich. Looking forward to it. Before we turn the floor over to our conversation, wanted to just set up for our listeners a brief bio of Adam Gustine. He is Associate Director of the Institute for Ethics and the Common Good at the University of Notre Dame. We mentioned that a couple of times in this conversation, so it'll come up again. His writing centers on the theological questions around justice and the ethical implications for people of faith committed to building a more just world. He's the author of Becoming a Just Church and co-author of Ecosystems of Jubilee. His current project is developing a renewed theological imagination around labor questions. Prior to Notre Dame, Adam worked in a variety of church, nonprofit, and denominational roles, and he is married to his wife, Anne. Together they are raising 3 kids in South Bend, Indiana.
Yeah, so when we saw Adam's book, Just Church, obviously it caught our attention. For me, writing a book called The Just Leader, and why it also caused us to perk up is we have conversations with our business leaders about how they're thinking about their faith and how that intersects with church and the ways in which that allows them to utilize their gifts through the relationships they have with the churches that they're a part of. And so Adam's insight around what he wrote, thinking through what it means for a church to be just, has just some unique parallels for us as we think about what it means to be a just leader.
Yeah, it's a really compelling content, and I think it'll leave our listeners with a lot to chew on. And so without further ado, we'll turn the floor over to our conversation with Adam Gustine. Adam, welcome to the 1110 Leadership Podcast. So glad to have you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rob and David, for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah, just as a disclaimer for our audience, just right out the gate, we may offend people or push on some buttons, but can we just agree not to go to the college football route? That feels like a safe, it feels like you playing the Notre Dame game right now it could be offensive in ways that we don't intend. So we're just going to leave college football out and what Notre Dame is doing in the world and just take a bypass. Can we agree on that?
Yeah, I think we can. If there was ever a reason to lean into the dividing walls of hostility being taken down in Christ, it's right there in college football.
David and I are in ACC country, and so if you agree not to throw stones at us, we won't throw stones at you, and we'll just all envy those who have it better.
Agreed.
Notre Dame is in the ACC.
Yes, exactly. In many ways we are. In one vital way we might not be.
That's right. That's great. I'm really grateful. David and I have been looking forward to this conversation with you, Adam, for a while. We've been working through so many issues around justice and what it looks like to be a just leader. And I think today represents new territory for us. Obviously, we talk about faithfulness in the church a lot and talk around that. But specifically, you've leaned into this topic in really thoughtful ways. And when you and I got connected and I found out that you had literally written a book on what does it mean to become a just church, I was really hoping that we would have an opportunity to put your thought leadership in front of our listeners. And I'd love to just jump straight in. You
Sure.
have this book, Becoming a Just Church. I would love to know how this was published in 2019. So it's a few years it's been out into the world. I'd love to just hear the origin story of what inspired you to write it. And then also a two-parter, how has your thinking and understanding of justice in the church evolved in the last 5 years since the book was released?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I appreciate just even the chance to reflect on that notion of how when you're in the midst of life and everything that the world has put us through over the last 5 or 6 years, it's nice to sit back and think, well, how has my thinking evolved on this? My motivation for writing that book is actually pretty similar to a lot of my motivations today related to why I'm still thinking about justice questions. And if I could give a really specific example is that I feel like unintentionally the church tends to talk about justice as though it is we might call it like a missional priority. It is almost like an outreach strategy. It's something we go and do out in the world. And one of the things that I think we miss in that is, maybe I'll say two things. The first thing is that when justice is primarily a conversation about things Christians go out and do in the world, underneath the surface is a little bit of an assumption that we have arrived ourselves and are so then going out in the world to enlighten and fix the world. And I think that while there may be an element of that because we sense that we have a keen appreciation for God's intentions in the world, so I think that there may be a layer at which that's the case. Certainly as the church, we have not arrived. Our story as the church broadly, the church in the United States, maybe particularly the white or more affluent church in the United States, certainly we probably should look ourselves in the mirror more than presume to have answers. And I'm motivated by that question. And the reason why I think that's such an important distinction to make is that theologically, Scripture really frames justice as a matter of faithfulness for the people of God, much more than, say, an outreach strategy. So if we were to break it down into the categories we might use in churches today, it's much more about discipleship than it is about outreach. If we look, the entire narrative of Scripture, you can check my math on this, but I am convinced that the perspective on the conversation around justice is almost always God or God's emissary speaking to the people of God, and justice is the evidence of their faithfulness. And so it's a very critical question because just that means that justice is not something we do more than something we are called to become, a just people, that there is a formational, transformational demand that justice places on us as people. We ought to be the first transformed entity in the world. And I think that to the extent that we prioritize that, the idea of going out to advocate and advance justice, I'm not saying it takes care of itself, but it certainly becomes part of that work much more naturally.
I love hearing that, Adam. It's something we talk about all the time, that justice is not what we do. It's more of who we are. It's about posture. It's about our heart. It's about our even position as we think about faith and the way God wants to use us, which is much more humbling, right? We have to look inside of ourselves first and really have a sense of where we see ourselves in light of God's heart and character around the issue of justice. In your book, you talk a good bit about God's shalom and what ultimately is the outcome of this. We're trying to have this sense of shalom all around us, in ourselves and in our communities and the people around us. Can you define what that is for us, what shalom is, and what does it look like when we practice that within a church community?
Yeah, that's a great question. One way that I think the conversation around justice has changed is that shalom's become much more ubiquitous. It's everywhere. People use that term a lot. And the danger, of course, with overuse is that we start to use it without really thinking about what it means. When I think about shalom, I come back to one of my spiritual heroes is John Perkins, who founded the Christian Community Development Association. And he's going to say that shalom is the state of nothing missing and nothing broken. A world where, as God sees it, nothing has gone missing and nothing has broken down. I actually think that in its simplicity is a pretty elegant definition of the word shalom. From the Hebrew to the English, we're often translating that word peace. Scholars are going to wrestle with what that means, actually, like what's the full scope of that word shalom. And I think we're on pretty safe ground to say that there's a way of thinking about the word peace in English that is just the absence of wrong. Peace is the absence of violence. Peace is the absence of conflict. But I think that also in English, there's another way of using, and that is the presence of something good. So if you were to say that a person is at peace with themselves or at peace with the situation, that doesn't just mean the absence of bad. It's like this existential sense of everything has fallen into place. To be at peace means that I'm experiencing goodness, that I'm experiencing beauty, that I'm experiencing wholeness. And that, I think, captures the essence of that word shalom, everything as it should be. So you ask the question, like, what does it look like when it's practiced in a church community? It's not just the absence of conflict, it's the presence of kinship. Like if I were to boil down the idea of shalom to a community characteristic, I think it is that idea of kinship. That's really what the Bible means, I think, when we're talking about shalom. I think that's also what Scripture means when it talks about the practice of hospitality, because I think Scripture has in mind this practice of welcome, where all people are welcome, meaning that there are no barriers to participation, there's no margins, there's no exclusion. People are welcome with every other person, meaning that conflict and abuse of power is not happening. People are welcome to bring their gifts and to contribute, which means that the concentration of participation doesn't push people off to the sides. It's a community of welcome that then lives its life in front of the world in such a way that it calls into question the fact that, hey, we live in a world that's full of exclusions, that's full of margins that people get pushed out to, full of exploitations. To me, a church that is practicing actively dismantling all of the ways in which people are not bound together in a sense of wholeness and goodness, that is what shalom looks like.
Yeah, that's convicting to hear, even as you're sharing this idea of not just the absence of the negative, but the presence of the positive, of something good. And I think that so oftentimes what we end up doing in our work is almost trying to redeem even the word justice and all of the offshoots of it and the issues of injustice, because people are really clear what they're against. And oftentimes, even within the church, it's hey, we want to make sure we name the wrong. And there's something to naming sin and calling it for what it is. But this idea of, are we putting equal, if not more, attention on naming the good and pursuing the positive and the wholeness and the shalom that you're talking about, that might be convenient for us why we don't do that, because it maybe require more of us to seek the good than just name the bad. And I love in your book, you mentioned hospitality. You define that as a way of being that creates a low barrier space of welcome for anyone encountered. And that Jesus invites us to take note of the fact that he's creating a family with the most vulnerable at the center. We'll take it there more. I'm sure we'll circle back to that. But when you think about the challenges that churches face specifically when trying to become communities of justice and shalom, what comes to mind for you?
I think as churches, we aren't particularly skilled or committed to being better at developing our capacity to engage with difference and disagreement. And Rob, you just actually pointed to this. We know what we are against. And I do believe that posture is maybe a little more pervasive than I wish it was. And frankly, probably even a little more pervasive in my own heart than I wish that it was. But when you gather people together, I think there's a difference between having theological convictions and having the ideological dogma. And by that, I think what I mean is that we idolize ideological fidelity in a way that does not allow us to encounter difference and disagreement. We divide over that. And there is a certain sense in which I think we view division over ideology, or what we might say is theology, but I think we maybe hold on to it too strongly. We divide over that, and that division is framed as a virtue. But what that means, I think, over the long haul is that our churches become places of increasing sameness. Increasingly, we are less and less diverse, even in the ways that we think about the world. We certainly are not encountering people who are not like us very much in our church community spaces. And that's a generalization. That's not, of course, the case everywhere. But in a broad strokes way, I think that the more insulated we become from one another, the harder it is for us to deal with difference and disagreement. And I really think that is the crux of where justice questions are worked out. It's very difficult to make meaningful progress on questions of justice if everyone is fundamentally the same. And if we've got like cultural sameness everywhere within our church community, we're not seeing the issues clearly, let alone addressing them. I think that is increasingly difficult. In a polarized world, it's increasingly difficult to cultivate church communities that can entertain disagreement, let alone actual structural differences or like cultural, ethnic, socioeconomic difference. All of those places become very tenuous and hard to hold together when we don't even know how to disagree with one another.
Yeah, it's like we've lost the skill just to be able to engage one another, approach one another around disagreement and work through that instead of just going to our different corners, right? With the people who resonate with the way we view things. In many ways, we find that this word, justice, is a very charged word, and it causes people to resist versus to push in. And so in our context, as we're working with business leaders, part of our hope is that we could redeem this idea a bit, which is hard within our culture. And yet we find that there is tremendous amount of opportunity for business leaders in particular to spark their creativity and imagination about the ways that God can use them when they're embracing and internalizing these ideas into their leadership, into who they are, not just what they do. Because many of our business leaders are focused on creating just and equitable workplaces. They want places where their people can thrive at work, where they love coming to work and they feel like they have meaning in their work. And their leadership is enabling that kind of thriving environment. And those business leaders are thriving themselves. So how would you take the principles that you've written about in becoming a just church and apply them to leaders in a business setting? And what can we as business leaders learn as we want to strive for this in our leadership that can help us foster a community that's thriving within our people, in our work? And so there's a sense of kinship and belonging, as you talked about, in our workplaces. And then we also have a vision for how our business can make wrong things right in the community. So it's both internal thriving and external thriving. How would you apply those principles to that context?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm thinking about these kinds of questions a lot. And I guess I would want to start by saying this, that I think that local churches are in desperate need of wise and experienced business leaders to extend the mission of the local church in the world. But it's not necessarily the way we normally do this. We may see a CEO in our congregation and say, oh, they lead that, they should be on the board of the church or something like that. Maybe, of course, that's true. But I actually think that the mission of God is much more concrete and much more engaged out in the world, that we actually need the business acumen of business leaders to extend the ministry of the local church. And that is the thing that doesn't happen enough in local churches, in my estimation. So in one sense, I think we actually need to tap into the skills and contributions of our business leaders, the very thing that they're best at. We need that in the local church. But then I also think that's a really interesting conversation, as you say, David, to think about how the principles of a just church might translate to a business. And I actually think I want to go back to the way you started to frame this question, is that there are so many ways in which people put their defenses up that make it very hard to even start this, especially when you start talking about justice in business or justice in the economic sector. Far too often, in my experience, critique or a justice-oriented question gets framed through the lens of some kind of like litmus test for economic ideology, such that if we challenge something in the existing status quo of our current economic system, it gets framed as, oh, this person has a socialist agenda. So we don't have to listen to the question. We can just push it off to the side. But I don't think we have to do that. I think we can ask questions of our current systems. I think we can ask questions of the economic status quo. And I think we can ask questions about our individual businesses that doesn't have to be a full like takedown of the capitalist system, but actually just interrogates the values that are like undergirding it, if that makes sense. And that is the thing to me that's a pretty interesting space, because I would not want to reduce justice in business to a matter of individual practices of the owner or the CEO. It's going to be much more structural than that, and it's going to be much more interconnected to the world than that. Like if I could give an example, and I'll try to do this quickly, like conventional wisdom would say that compensation is set based on the economic return of a particular role. So wages are set relative to the value that they bring to the organization. And generally speaking, that's why compensation is higher at the top than maybe at the bottom of the business hierarchy. And I think that's also then one of the justifications for that disparity. If we were to talk about it, it was like these positions, these roles, this person delivers more economic value to the business, and so their compensation is higher. And so what we're doing is appealing to the economic value that individual jobs play, and then that's how we talk about wages. And if we accept the premise that economic value should determine wages, then we don't ask any other questions. We move on. But if I'm thinking about justice, I think we need to ask an ethical question. I think we need to say, should the disparity be what it is, as an example? And if I ask that question, then I'm like, okay, what is the alternative? Maybe we root the question of wages in something other than economic return on value. Maybe if we're trying to cultivate like a Christian disposition to thinking about justice, maybe we would say, okay, maybe economic value is not a value neutral idea. So this is almost a cliche, but it's a decent example. Professional athletes are compensated incredibly well, generally speaking. And certainly they're compensated much higher than, say, a school teacher. And if you're saying, okay, it's because athletes deliver huge economic value to their organization, it would be naive not to then also acknowledge that the reason they deliver that economic value is because of society's like overwhelming affection for sports. Now, should society value sports to that extent, to the disparity of the way that we value education for our children? To me, now we're talking about an ethical question. There was a turn of the 1900s labor priest whose name is Father John Ryan, and he introduced this idea of the ethical value of labor. What is the contribution that this role is giving to society? What's the value that they bring to our communities? What if we started to ask questions about compensation like that? To me, that changes the entire thing. Now, the issue there is that doesn't have to be a critique of capitalism to say, let's ask question about our values that guide the sort of underlying operational premises of our work. So is that a controversial statement? It could be, depending on how you ask it or where we ask it. But somebody who's really thinking about justice needs to be willing to let go to that level to interrogate values and that sort of thing.
I know a lot of teachers who would love to have that conversation
Yeah.
about having our value being the ethical contribution of the work that we do. It's fascinating. And again, it's complex. And what you're talking about is getting to real root questions, root issues that we often don't see that we need to ask unless we're in environments of people who are really wrestling with these issues and again can push into that conflict.
I just get hung up on the fact that someone who says we value sports too much is coming from the Notre Dame guy. He's saying, oh, you're one of the biggest sports brands in the world. There's a contradiction right there. We're all works in progress, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
I love the language you use in your book, Adam, of really talking about the church. And I think in this conversation, we've broadened the church to not think of just the four walls of where we spend our Sundays, but the church as the people of God. I love that you spend, honestly, the first part of your book, a surprising amount for me coming in saying this is a book on justice, on making this shift from being people of God to a people, right? This idea of kinsmanship and saying we're in this together. You get into this idea of the parish and how important it is to really have a geographic specificity to how these things get lived out. And we love that. We really try to drill that down of connection to place. Our whole company is named 1110 Leadership based on this tiny little verse in Proverbs of when the righteous prosper, the city rejoices. So, well, what city are we talking about? And we need to name those things and be really specific. Another term I love in your book is referring to the church as parable community. And you say it's designed to be both this incredibly ordinary thing and this incredibly subversive force in the world that meaningfully engages its community while simultaneously challenging the status quo. And you've already started to take that there. We use the both and language on this podcast all the time to capture this isn't an either or. It's not pick the ordinary or the subversive. It's not pick the individual focused or the systemic. So I would love for you just to drill down on that a little bit more. When you think about a leader really trying to embody the both andedness of this conversation in their leadership of their business, you're saying, hey, I'm not saying burn down capitalism, but also maybe ask some hard questions about how I exist within a system like that. Can you just speak more to what kind of challenges a business leader may face if they start down this path?
Sure. Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I'll try to make the jump here quickly. When I say the church is a parable community, the idea there is that the role of the church or the vocation of the church is to create a way of life that is on display. It's almost like an experiment in subversive ways of living, if that makes sense. That our way of life is not necessarily always walking up to society to challenge directly to their face, but actually to demonstrate an alternative that acts as a critique. Now, it seems to me that somebody who owns their own business or somebody who is in a position of leadership in a business is positioned to do the same thing. What experiments can you do in your business that is a break from the norm that might ask society to look in the mirror a little bit? And it's that sense to me that makes this idea of challenging the status quo more of a generative idea. It does not have to be a takedown. There are times where we need to say, this is wrong and it must change. So I don't want to suggest that. But I think that those times where we say that are lended credibility when our way of life is actually backing that up. And I think that when you create a generative alternative, when you create an experiment within your business, you actually set up a pretty interesting dynamic where what if you were asking radically different questions about compensation within your business? That will cause other businesses, that will cause other entities, organizations, and institutions within your city, within your community, maybe just across your industry, to take note. They're going to see that and say, wait, what's going on over there? Now, the interesting thing is that when we do that, anything that challenges the status quo is interrogating inherited values. It's going to question the sort of normative operating mechanisms of the way that people normally do things. And anytime somebody sees something that's different than what they're doing, it's going to create tension. And sometimes tension is always uncomfortable. But I think that's the space that we want to enter. I think we want to create patterns of business. We want to create economic activity that creates tension in a particular space. Like I say, it could be your industry, it could be your community, and then enter that tension and narrate what you're doing and why. And to me, if I'm thinking about how would I translate this notion of the church as parable to like the people of God inhabiting a parable, I think we want to get to a space where we're willing to say, I'm going to do something radical. And then when people ask or when it creates that tension, I'm going to get in there and I'm going to talk about why we're doing that. Now, the challenge of that is that it really takes long haul commitment to do that, because there's so many different stakeholders that have to buy into that notion. It's the leadership, it's your workforce, it's your shareholders. And when you introduce that tension, everyone will feel it. And so navigating an organization through that tension to get to the point where you're even seeing any of the fruit of those experiments, I think that's a real challenge. So I would not want to downplay that. I actually think that's probably the biggest challenge we have, is getting everyone inside to buy in long enough to produce some fruit there.
What you're describing, we've actually seen business leaders that we work with engage with that, and you've put words to what they have done, which is really helpful and very encouraging. Think of one of our companies who revamped their whole compensation strategy in the industry in order to create incentives for their people, enhance their value, and to give them opportunities really to grow and be a part of really driving the organization forward that has transformed their culture, particularly as it relates to people feeling like they're valuable, just simply that. And they wanted to make sure that was the value that they wanted to communicate. And the way they did that was through compensation, as you've alluded to before. So that's a good example of how we want to foster creativity and imagination. And it's largely, a lot of times it's under the radar. It's slow. This company took a long time to have to undo what they had set up before, to test it and even think about how it was going to work. It took a lot of time, a lot of investment, which a lot of times we don't want to do, but the benefit in the long haul has been extraordinary. I want to get to this idea of power because you dedicate an entire chapter to power in your book, which is great because I dedicate a good amount of time to power in my book as well, because power and justice are so uniquely tied together. And you say power is the linchpin of justice. Good intentions do not overcome an unhealthy power dynamic. Getting power right is a question of posture, process, perspective, and voice, which is great. Can you really speak about that and the role of power in the pursuit of justice? And maybe what are some questions we as business leaders can ask ourselves so that we can know for sure that we're stewarding our power in the right way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the earliest lessons that I learned on this is just, as you say, power is the ball game as it relates to questions of justice, particularly within sort of individual organizations. And I'll tell you a story by my way of answering this question. And that is, so I've worked in a number of different places. And one of the organizations that I've worked in, the senior leader was thinking about questions of power, which is good. But their response, and I think this might be the normal or natural initial response for anybody that understands or comes to terms with the fact that A, I have a lot of power, and B, that's actually creating problems in some way, that the power differentials are problematic. What this leader did was to say, okay, we're flattening the hierarchy now. I'm not the leader. We're all in this together. And essentially, they like overnight started to try and narrate a totally flat power structure within the organization. Now, the problem with that is that's just not true. It's not true that just because the senior leader says we're all equals at this table, that we're actually all equals at the table. And I think that's actually the first move that a lot of leaders make. And that may be more dangerous because what it does is it pretends like power doesn't exist. And then power is not stewarded at all. David, your question of how do I steward power? If you pretend like you don't have power and we're all in this together as equals, actually, you're not stewarding it. You're just like putting it on the back shelf. And the reality is that everybody else in your organization knows that's what happens because they're the ones that experience this sort of falseness. It's a superficial mutuality. Because at the end of the day, that senior leader still holds all the cards. They can still override every decision. They can still bring their perspective and make what they want to happen. They can wield that power anytime they want because they've put it on the shelf behind them. They haven't given it away, if that makes sense. So I think that's the first thing that I would say is the move cannot be to immediately flatten the hierarchy. I think we need to actually wrestle with the reality of our power, the privilege that affords whoever it is has it, and then to think very concretely about what it means to create process and structure and accountability for the wise distribution of that power across your organization, if that makes sense. Yeah. So if I'm asking questions of myself, I want to ask, first of all, what am I doing with my power? What am I actually doing with it? Am I pretending it doesn't exist? Am I lording it over others? Am I actually finding ways to distribute authority, if that's not too loaded of a word, across the organization? And I actually think we're in much better position if we try to make power visible within our organizations rather than hide it. I think it's much better to name the reality of power and name the existing power dynamics within an organization so that we can then talk about the question of distribution. So that first question is like, what am I actually doing with it? Secondly, I really want to ask who gets to make decisions? At the end of the day, who gets to make decisions? And if I'm a senior leader, how do I push decision-making power, quote unquote, further down the ladder? Because I think that's one of the ways we best create just workplaces is actually give the agency of power, recognize people's agency and distribute decision-making power as far down the ladder as we can. In theological circles, we might call that like the principle of subsidiarity, the idea that like power is best exercised as close to the ground as possible, rather than concentrated away from where the impact of those decisions is going to be felt most strongly. I think we can do that in businesses and communities and churches. We ought to be doing that. And I think that is at the same time a personal and a structural question. So it's not just a matter of my own like posture. It's going to create policy as well. And I think we need to acknowledge and lean into that. And then there's this question that we're asking at Notre Dame this year that I'm finding myself very compelled by. We're spending this year asking the question, what do we owe one another? And I'm intrigued by that as somebody who's been in positions of like senior leadership in churches. And I can imagine it would be potentially an equally intriguing question if I was the senior leader of a business or a company. What do we owe each other here? What do I owe the different people and the different constituencies that are around me, my leadership team, the workforce, my shareholders? What do we actually owe one another? Not in an economic sense as much as in an ethical sense. Who am I indebted to here? And the answer to that cannot always be the shareholder. Like, I think that we need to really plumb the question, what do I owe all of this community and the individual parts within it, creating a pretty like spacious way of answering that question. Those are a few of the questions that came to mind as I'm thinking about that.
That's so great. And Adam, we really enjoyed this conversation. And I think you've given our listeners a lot to think about when it comes to not only their own work and vocation and leadership, what does it look like for their kind of 9 to 5 and how they hone in on these areas in pursuit of just leadership, but then also back to church experience and kind of the idea of we want those things to all be integrated. And I think some of these conversations feel like there is really clear overlap in that Venn diagram with distinctions. You're giving people a framework of how they can look at their lives, all of their lives, both who they are as a person of faith in their relationship with an institution of a church, but then also how they can go and be the church in their concrete context. We love ending our episodes with a bottom line, some kind of closing thought or action step, piece of advice, or even just a simple reflection that you can leave our listeners with as they really just try to process and synthesize what they've heard today. So we'll give you the floor and let you provide our listeners with a bottom line today.
Sure. I think one of the hard things in my experience about caring deeply about questions of justice is that the scope of the issues is great. There's so many things that need our attention. That can be overwhelming. But also the temptation can be, when I have the space and influence to instigate change, to initiate something that I think is a more just space, to try and do it all at once, or to be dissatisfied if I can't fix everything right now. The idea of not being able to fix everything right now, can create a kind of inertia that I would want to maybe encourage folks not to give into. That really, actually, I think justice comes through small, intentional change. And that the more we identify some specific area that we can attend to then actually attend to it and make change, that actually gains momentum. That builds on itself. Small, local, organic grassroots changes are the things that over time give rise to the large structural changes. I'm maybe an armchair historian, but to me, it seems like most of the cataclysmic justice movements only become that way through the long haul cultivation of local, small experiments. And that over time, actually, it builds the momentum to create those large structural changes. If I'm a business leader, when I identify those areas, when it's brought to my attention, very often I think that's where it's going to come. Somebody's going to say it to me. Now, if I have the ears and eyes to see it, let's lean into those changes where we can, make the kinds of small progress, and not let that be something that discourages us, that we can't change it all. Small wins are wins. And I think that's true.
Adam, you're encouraging our listeners to take a next step, which is to think about what is the small, surgical, and slow initiative that we can take that makes sense for us, that we're just going to try. And it could be anything. We're not going to be paralyzed by the big issues, all the things that are out there, but things that we can pursue that get after what you've been talking about to us today. So really encouraged. Thank you so much for being with us.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure.
That's great. Awesome, Adam. Go Irish. Really enjoyed the time. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks.
All right. To learn more about 1110 Leadership, visit our website at 1110leadership.com. That's the numerals 11, then spelled out TEN leadership.com. That's 11 TEN leadership.com. There you'll find more resources to equip you on the journey of becoming an 1110 leader. You can also get connected to our growing leadership network. If you've enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend. To help others find us, you can also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.